So, hello everyone. Hello again on Wednesdays, the Science Wednesdays from NAbSA. Thank you all for joining. We have a great discussion last week, kicking off with our colleague Nicholas McFlern with the STAR metric. And today we will be delighted to have a new session with new colleagues, and even more delighted to have joining us colleagues that are not part of the IUCN Secretariat, which is even better to know like what our IUCN partners and members they are doing also when it comes to science. Uh, but before we deep dive in today's session on the red list of ecosystem, just a couple of reminders for the session. Please, for any comments you may have, any reactions, any links you would like to share during the session, please use the chat option. And of course, you can post there your questions, but also you can use the Q&A. We will have two small sections of Q&A, so please, any question you may have, we are always happy to share and to give you the floor if you prefer to address those questions personally. And most importantly, the session is being interpreted also in French. So you can click in the interpretation icon and select the language you prefer, whether English or French. And finally, the recording and the slide will be shared with all of you, both in English and French. So please just stay tuned with the emails that we will be sharing from the NAbSA team. And as I mentioned before, to deep dive into the red list of ecosystems, we would like to just to give you a reminder, and for those who has never heard before about NAbSA. So what is NAbSA? The NAbSA is an IUCN project funded by Global Affairs Canada, and the aim is to improve climate resilience and reduce poverty for vulnerable communities in sub-Saharan Africa. This project is part of the overall portfolio on partnering for climate, and we are part together with other 19 projects, part of this climate community of practice. And the aim of NAbSA, in a nutshell, is concentrated in three main pillars. First is providing capacity building and technical assistance as per request to the whole partnering for climate community, and then of course document the stories, the hard work that all these projects are doing on the ground together with the local partners, and to document the lessons learned, best practices, and so on, and then to be able to showcase all this work and influence policy nationally, globally. And as I say, I'm today delighted to present you and introduce you one of IUCN partners with whom we have a long-standing relationship. And I will like to hand it over to you, Carol Poole, who is the Deputy Director for Biodiversity Project Management for SANBI, an organization based in South Africa. So please, Carol, over to you. I can share the screen and pass the slides for you, and you just need to say next.
Okay, perfect. That sounds excellent. Hi, everyone. So yes, as Veronica said, my name is Carol Poole. I work for the South African National Biodiversity Institute. So can you move on to my first slide? And then I'm going to share with you today a guide that SANBI brought out with UNEP WCMC in 2016 already, but it was updated last year at COP16. So next slide, please. So SANBI is one of the CBD TSC technical support centers. So we are one of the I think there's 18 around the world hosting a TSC technical support center. That's the technical and scientific cooperation mechanism of the CBD. It's always a bit of a mouthful. So we've got 9 countries who are involved with us. There you can see them on the map, with the Seychelles off a bit to the side there. It's quite hard to get the Seychelles on the map at the same time. And what's really fantastic is that some of the work that SANBI's been doing in the Southern African region is really relevant. And I'm going to share with you today about some of the items in this guide that we launched. And I just wanted to tell you that yeah, we hope that there's many other opportunities like this for SANBI to share some of the work that we've been doing as a sub-regional support center. Lesson sharing and capacity building is certainly one of the main key things for the TSC support center roles, you know, so this is very exciting, and thanks for inviting me. On the right-hand side of the screen there, you see this what we call the SPAP regional project. It stands for Spatial Biodiversity Assessment, Prioritization and Planning. And it's 4 countries, and it's currently supported by some French donors. So I'm going to use some of the examples from those countries today in the presentation. Next, please. So this approach, this book that we brought out, this guidebook called Mapping Biodiversity Priorities, was launched at COP16. It was quite a nice official side event at COP16 where the South African Deputy Minister was there, and the UNEP WCMC Deputy Director and our CEO. And the translation to French is underway, just so you all know, with our French colleagues. So that's really exciting. And of course, the guide was welcomed by both the IUCN and the CBD Secretariat, because it uses many, many IUCN standards, and I'll show you those now. And of course, is highly relevant for several of the GBF targets. Next slide, please. Here we go. Okay, it seems to have cut off the top of my slides, but that's just fine. So there's the full name of the document, Mapping Biodiversity Priorities, a practical approach to spatial biodiversity assessment and prioritization to inform national policy planning decisions and actions. It's a bit of a mouthful. We call it the Mapping Biodiversity Priorities approach, but it's much more than mapping. So this is really, we're trying to promote it as a practical approach for any country, no matter where you are in terms of your data and your map processes. It's really a sequential process. And I'll show you now several of the targets of the GBF. Several of the processes in the guide are the exact results you need for several of the GBF indicators. It uses very few, like a few key foundational spatial data sets, which most countries can pull together, even if you use the global equivalent of your national data set. And the products really have a range of applications. So that mainstreaming side of things is really important, and I can show you a couple of examples. And the second edition brought out in 2024. As I said, the first edition was 2016. But since then, of course, there's been the Global Ecosystems Typology, the IUCN Red List of Ecosystems standard. We've incorporated the Red List of Threatened Species work as well, and of course, key biodiversity areas. Some of the pieces of the method have already been applied in several countries, so Botswana, Ethiopia, Ghana, Rwanda, Uganda, and then this current project is with Namibia, Mozambique, and Malawi, with South Africa. Next, please. Okay, so this is the crux of the guidebook. We say that answering 3 key questions about biodiversity can be useful for a range of decision-making and a range of decisions about what way to act. So what biodiversity does a country have, and where is it? That's the sort of blue block there, the spatial data sets block. What is the state of that biodiversity across the landscape and seascape? In other words, what is its red list status? And we also then look at protection level, which I'll tell you a little bit more about. And where and how should a country first act? So that's the key. Like, we all have way too much to do with our budgets, current budgets, especially in Africa. So how can we really prioritize about where we should act first? And if you've got these foundational first 2 questions, it really helps you answer the third questions of where to act. All right, next slide, please. Okay, so take you into a little bit more detail. We use, as I said, all these international standards. So if you look at the left-hand side of the slide there's 4 simple data sets. A baseline map of ecosystem types, which uses the IUCN Global Ecosystem Typology. And as I said, there's many, many global data sets out there. There's even the Global Ecosystems Atlas that is trying to pull together ecosystems of the world, but from the national level upwards. So we are working with them. in Southern Africa, quite a showcase of the Global Ecosystems Atlas. So that's your baseline map of ecosystem types. And it's not as hard as you think. If your country hasn't done it before, it's not as hard as you think it is. This guide takes you through the simple steps that are needed. Then you need a map of current extent and condition. Okay, so what condition are those ecosystems in? Is there a tarmac over it? Is it a shopping mall? No. Is it a wetland, etc.? What status is it in? A map of protected and conserved areas. Of course, there's obviously global data sets of protected areas, but usually countries have a national data set of protected and conserved areas. And then maps of species occurrence. And for the species side of this process, we recommend that countries start with perhaps your endemic species, perhaps species that are in use. You don't have to start like, how do I assess all my species? It's not practical. So you pick and choose which species are important to put into the process. So then in the middle of this diagram is the assessment part. And this is where we use the IUCN Red List of Ecosystems and the IUCN Red List of Threatened Species, the two red list standards of the world. And you're all familiar with that red list concept. It's an indicator of how threatened that biodiversity is, and you end up in categories of threat status, so critically endangered, or perhaps least concern, we hope, or data deficient, which also tells you something. So then what might be less familiar to you is that South Africa developed a method to assess protection level of ecosystems and species. And there's currently no global standard for such an assessment, but I think it's potentially coming, especially because of Target 3 of the GBF. So protection level is an indicator of the extent to which ecosystems or species are adequately protected in the network of protected or conserved areas. So we include OECMs in that space, as long as you've got a map of your OECMs. And it highlights, if your ecosystems or species are not protected and whether they're well protected, is the whole range of that particular species in a protected area, then it would be well protected, So yeah, this is particularly important because of that representativity element of GBF Target 3. So our guide explains this to you in quite simple way of how to do protection level assessments. And then on the right-hand side, in the guide, we give sort of 3 types of prioritization and planning. You could, of course, just combine the results of your red listing, your risk status, with your protection level. And you could have a basic prioritization. You could look at critically endangered and not protected species or ecosystems. And that would immediately tell you that those are desperately needing some form of restoration or some form of protection or whatever mainstreaming side of things you're going towards. Then secondly, you could apply like a multi-criteria approach, such as the Key Biodiversity Areas standard, and that would identify particular sites that are important for biodiversity. And we give you a little bit of an overview of the KBA method in the book. And then, of course, most complicated, and not all countries have done this, of course, is a systematic conservation planning. And that's using specialist software and biodiversity representativity targets. And really, it's a fairly much more complex process. And of course, but that is where we are trending towards in terms of GBF Target 1, that biodiversity inclusive spatial planning. And can our systematic conservation planning be fed into national spatial planning processes? Thanks. Next slide, please. So what I particularly like about this guide is it doesn't, it tries to keep things as simple as possible. So I really encourage you to read it. It is a book. It takes a bit to digest. But I particularly like section 3, which is called the guiding principles. And there's 10 guiding principles, but I kind of picked my top 4. One of the key things is really just make a start. Start with the best available information. You don't have to have perfect information, right? You can just start simply and plan for iterative improvements, as it says in number 5. There's no ways we can all be, have this fantastic map of ecosystems. South Africa's been mapping its ecosystem since, the 1950s. Like we've had iterative and processes of ecosystem maps. And then be inclusive and engage stakeholders is number 9, very, very key. These products are not going to be used unless you engage the stakeholders right from the start. You're talking with them, you say, what is the use case for this particular product? How are you going to use it? Can we tweak it for your use case, for example? And then make the products freely and widely accessible. Many people ask us, why doesn't SANBI charge for our data? Because, we have limited funding and that sort of thing. So why don't we commercialize some of our data? And we fight very hard to keep it clear that the biodiversity data must be freely accessible to everyone. So whether it's business or whether it's, restoration programs or climate change adaptation programs, they must all have it available, because otherwise they will all go off on their own tangents about where and how to get that biodiversity data. Thanks. Next slide, please. So I'm going to take you through a couple of examples from the countries involved in the regional project that I spoke about. So this has a banner that's missing. It says Namibia. Hopefully you can recognize that's Namibia on the southwest coast of Africa there. They've literally just finished their map of ecosystem types. It's a very beautiful map. You can see there on the left-hand side. They've got 25 regional ecosystem functional groups. This is at IUCN GET level 4. So that's really great. These groups are subdivided into 217 ecosystem types, which is at GET level 5 and 6. And just an example from Namibia on their species, so this map of ecosystems, they're now going to proceed to do their red list of ecosystems that Marcos is going to talk to you about today. But on the species side, they've got a huge number of site-based work that they're doing to feed species red list assessments into the area, into the impact assessments that are underway for green hydrogen development. Huge spaces, some of them in protected area, existing protected areas. Namibia's got a great network of protected areas. These sites that have been earmarked for potential green hydrogen development. And it's really key that you can speak to the threatened species so that you can feed into these local level processes. Next, please. So here's Malawi, another nice example. They're about to bring out their 3rd iteration of the red list of ecosystems, and they're actually going to include Lake Malawi this time because they've now mapped their lake. The big green swathe coming down there is basically their lake. It was marked as least concern, but actually that's probably not true. It probably should have been listed as data deficient, but they now actually have been able to map their ecosystem types in the lake, and then they can now actually red list them. And the applications in Malawi seem to be a certain number. They're doing a national state of environment report, trying to feed all this information into their environmental and social impact assessment processes. They've got very good guidelines, but they don't have, they don't have instructions for the EIA practitioners to use these data sets, but they're working on that now. They're undertaking a national ecosystem assessment, and they're talking to their physical planning department. So in the space of national planning processes and GBF Target 1, they're ensuring that all of these products, their maps and their red lists get into those national planning processes. Next slide, please. Here's Mozambique. So now we're on the eastern coast of Southern Africa. Mozambique's actually achieved a huge amount. They've got a great map of ecosystem types. They've red listed that several times. They can actually crosswalk their ecosystem types to the global ecosystem typology. They're in the global ecosystem atlas. So if they can actually do comparisons, they were featured at COP16 about being able to look at what Marcus is going to tell you about, a little bit red list of ecosystems, but actually starting to look at an index of that. And, those are the kinds of graphs you can produce looking at your red list of ecosystems. And then on the right-hand side, you can see they've already identified their key biodiversity areas. They've got SIBMOS, which is their Mozambican biodiversity information system, where all of this stuff is freely available. And they can really even start to look at, how protected are their KBAs on the graph on the bottom right. Next. So this is me wrapping up, and I just wanted to say, this sequential approach of mapping, assessing, prioritization, planning, mainstreaming, and then using this information for whether it is climate adaptation or restoration planning or anything else. You know, in South Africa, we've used it for a mining and biodiversity guidelines. We've used it for systematic conservation planning. We've got all sorts of things that we use these things for. But the basic understanding of having that map of ecosystem types, having your red list of species and ecosystems, and having a network of key biodiversity areas is really, really important. There's many global processes. As I mentioned, Southern Africa was actually featured in the Global Ecosystems Atlas that was launched at COP16. You can see there we've got near to wall-to-wall coverage, and the Namibia map is about to be included as well. And there's all the targets of the GBF that this approach speaks to. The red list of ecosystems is an indicator under several of those targets, either a headline or a component or complementary indicator. And even the targets are mainstreaming, like 14 and 15. This approach really, really helps you with that. And we also have a sister guide called Mainstreaming Biodiversity Priorities, and it just gives some tips. And it's not a comprehensive guide on how to mainstream biodiversity. It's like a sort of tips and tricks guide. I think that's it. Thanks. Next slide, please. And then I just wanted to tell you that I'm really hopeful to have an overview e-learning course about this approach. That would be the ideal. So I'm investigating how to make that happen, and you can scan the QR code to download the guide, and we'll share this presentation with you so that you've got the links. Thank you. That's it.
Thank you so much, Carol. I really much appreciate it. I have to say it's super useful to see like how the red list of ecosystem can be applied in a real case. I think it's one of the questions that maybe, well, Marcos, he can respond to this, not myself, but it's one of the questions when having this training and session on the red list of ecosystem is like, and now what? I have all this data. I have all these data sets, and now what I can do? This is one of the questions, so it's extremely useful to see how it can be used for national planning, but also for something that is that we really try the international community to do more and more, is how we can showcase that we are contributing to existing global frameworks. In this case, you mentioned the global biodiversity framework, so it's extremely useful to see like this is possible, and it's not only purely science behind, it's like also practice. And with this, knowing that you have to leave, Carol, I would like to open the floor for colleagues in the room. If you have any questions, please, as mentioned, please, you can put it in the chat or raise your hand, or another option is to put it in the Q&A. So you have plenty of options for questions. Otherwise, I may have my own questions too, but it's not that I would like to only be the one being lucky to ask you questions. So while the ice is being broken, I would like to ask you, Carol, like how you have been showcasing the case study for Malawi, Mozambique too. So these are mostly requests that you receive from countries themselves, or is part of your research, or if you would like to explain a little bit more on that, please.
Sure. So as I said, South Africa is now a TSC, a sub-regional support center under the CBD. But we've actually been working in this sort of regional support space for a number of years already. And that's why we've had existing projects with Malawi and past projects with Mozambique. This project now funded by the French is actually the first time we're working with Namibia, and they're our neighbor, so it's great. But yeah, we've worked with Botswana before, and then like a few countries in Africa. It's been really interesting, and sort of we've really tested the approach now, and that's why we're so confident about it, that we're selling it to other countries and saying this is really, a simple approach to follow. You do the best you can. You can do the simplest data sets. And I think what's important is that as underdeveloped countries of Africa, we need to sell this approach to our decision makers and people who understand the need to invest in these processes. you know, you can do most of the mapping and whatever for free, but you kind of need to ground truth it. So that field work is important, you know, and the use of tools like iNaturalist or other tools like that, where we can get citizen scientists to assist in these processes, are really important too. So that buy-in, you know, South Africa's government, since the end of apartheid in 1994, you know, environment issues are part of the constitution, and the South African government has invested in making sure that biodiversity issues are cross-sectoral. Not say that we've got it all right, but you know, it was really great. So the South African National Biodiversity Institute is one of the few sort of official biodiversity institutes in the world. Like Colombia's got one and China's got one, you know. So, you know, there are a few other countries, but it makes it really easier to have that investment in these underlying processes, the maps and the assessments. It's really key. And then the countries can there's so much you can do with them, as you say, so much.
Yeah, thanks, Carol, because indeed there is one question that I find is linked to what you just say about the role of countries. The question is from our colleague Kerry Max from Global Affairs Canada, who is also thanking you for the presentation. And his question is about assistance. So for countries or other actors wishing to use the guide, are there resources or funding or any technical assistance to accompany the process? And I would like them to link to another thing.
Well, I'm hoping that most of the CBD sub-regional support centers will be helping countries. I know that resource mobilization is a key need. So the 9 countries that belong to our Southern African TSC support center have all said resource mobilization is key. You know, so we have to showcase what we've already done, package it well. So no, there's no sort of fundraising guidance in the book, but you know, I think through your technical support centers, you must make sure that they're aware of this guide, they're aware of the processes you want to follow. And you know, it's iterative, it's bit by bit. So maybe you'll have, for example, in South Africa, there was an investment a couple of years ago in foundational biodiversity science, and they wanted DNA barcodes and species, you know, field samples and things like that. So you apply to them for that particular element of the sequential process. And maybe Marcos can say whether there's funding available for the ecosystem side of the process, you know. So I think the different funders are interested in different things. And I think certainly if you can prove the value of this sequential process, I mean, we're starting to even look at like nature finance, and some of our data sets are used in that nature related risks work, you know. But if you can prove then in the business and the corporate sector that actually they can't do their nature related risks work, the TNFD stuff, without having the underlying spatial data sets, then you can sell it to even businesses and, you know, TNFD type of organizations and bodies in the country or internationally. I hope that helps.
Yeah, definitely. And you tapping into another very important topic, disclosure, that I think we could even go into another full session only discussing about disclosure. I would like to, it was your last word, but I think very relevant one. You did mention about e-learning course. So I'm curious to see like how these e-learning course could be very practical for practitioners. Practical for practitioners.
So what's interesting is that pieces of this sequential process already exist as e-learning courses. So I'm sure Marcus will tell you about the Red List of Ecosystems one that already exists on the IUCN Academy e-learning platform. There's also one, obviously, species threats. Red List of Species has several courses. What's not done is an overview of the whole sequential process. So that's the e-learning course I'm trying to put together now. I'm seeking funding, seeking partners to do that, because I think explaining this whole sequential process as it is in the book is like it's quite a, wow, that's interesting. You know, it's a sequential process. We always sort of, countries used to tackle it as, oh, we're going to do a red list of species now, and we're going to tackle mammals, for example. And it's this one piece, but it's a piece of a much bigger puzzle. And I think it's that whole puzzle that needs to be explained. And that's how we can sell it to our decision makers and say, you must invest in all elements of this big puzzle. So it's that overview course that I'd like to have, which would be a 2-3 hour probably online e-learning course. It's like an overview. It's sort of an expanded version of what I've done now. And then it would point the technical people and it would say, go to the Red List of Ecosystems course if you're a technical person and you need to learn that. So that is my aim for the overview course. It would point people in the right direction of where to learn more.
Very super helpful. And thank you so much for making this effort to happen. Just the last question, because we have a colleague just posted this question. I will read it in French and then translate it to you. Not sure about if you speak French, but I will translate it also for other colleagues in joining us in the webinar. So the question is, merci pour votre présentation. Thanks for your presentation. Est-ce que les centres de support technique sont différents des centres d'excellence sur la biodiversité? And it's our colleague Nicolas Guillet from one of the projects we work with in West Africa. So the question is if it's the support technical centers are the same that the Center for Excellence for Biodiversity, for the CBD.
I don't think so. So these 18 technical, scientific, and cooperation support centers were all announced at COP16. Well, I think even earlier than COP16. So there's 18 around the world. I forget all the African ones. They've all got different. I'll find the list. I think COMIFAC, and then the East African one is RMICD. But I'll find the list of all the African ones. So I don't think they're the same as the centers of excellence, because I'm not actually sure about the centers of excellence. But I'll post the link to the TSC support centers in the chat.
Thank you so much, Carol. Really much appreciated for your time. And we hope to see you any other time. And with that, I see also Marcos is raising your hand, but then you will have the time to also start your presentation, because now is the time for you. But if you would like to address something before we move into your presentation, Marcos?
Yeah, I wanted to answer this question about Centre d'Excellence for the Biodiversity versus the technical support centers. I think in the case of West Africa, Centre d'Excellence de la Biodiversité are different. So I think Rampao, for example, is a Centre d'Excellence de la Biodiversité, while the Technical Support Center for West Africa is a Centre de Suivi Écologique based in Dakar, Senegal. So I have the impression that they are slightly different, but depending on the context, we may be using interchangeable. But I think technical support center are specific centers identified by the Global Biodiversity Framework to support countries in the implementation of the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. How to operationalize this regional support, that's what is under discussion. And Carol mentioned that there is an ongoing discussion in how these centers will be able to mobilize funds.
Thank you, Marcos, for this information. And we are posting also in the chat the link to the different centers as per the CBD decision. Thanks again to Carole, and I hope, Nicolas, on a répondu à ta question. Autrement, on est toujours ouvert pour envoyer plus de ressources à ce sujet. And now I would like to move to you, Marcos. Marcos Valderrabano, my esteemed colleague, he's the senior coordinator for the RLE list of ecosystem, and he's based in headquarters in Switzerland. So Marcos, now over to you for your presentation. Please, you just need to say next slide, and then I will move on to another.
Thank you Thank you very much, Veronica, and thanks a lot, Carol. Fantastic presentation. I really appreciate you joining us today. Especially relevant to hear a practitioner view on how do we in practice use these tools for a concrete cases. So thank you very much. Really impressive how much South Africa is innovating and pioneering these tools in practice. I'm now gonna go take one step back and go into some of the background of why we do what we do. Next slide, please. I wonder if anyone, we see both. That's too late. I was gonna ask, does anyone recognize what this bird is? But now you've already seen it. So next slide, please. Well, the answer I suppose was gonna say no one was recognizing that bird because that's the passenger pigeon. The last living individual died in 1914. And I wanted to bring this sad example to the light because 250 years ago, this was the most abundant bird in all the Americas and probably around the world, with a population of several billion individuals. The records from that time are breathtaking, mentioning the sky becoming completely black when this passenger pigeon was flying over for days and days of huge colonies of sometimes a billion individuals flying over and over and over the same place. The branches of the trees where they nested would break until the weight of the birds. And that was only 250 years ago. We're not talking about the last glaciation. This is a species that got extinct with massive hunting in North America. Now, the challenge is that because we are species that live short time, we don't remember this. This happened few generations ago. We don't see the scale of the change, but the change is happening, and it's happening at a speed that is really changing the surface of the Earth. Next slide, please. So similar to what happened with the passenger pigeon, that we don't remember it because we were not there 250 years ago. We don't remember how this hill used to be covered by Cetus atlantica just 50 or 100 years ago. In very few exceptions, when we see an ecosystem, we can imagine that it's rapidly changing, like in this particular case, when we see that climate change and soil erosion is changing the composition of these forests from being dominated by Cetus atlantica to being dominated by Quercus rotundifolia. But there are only few examples. In most of the cases, the scale of the change doesn't allow us to see what is really happening and how quickly the landscape and the ecosystems are changing. Next slide, please. This is another example. In most of the cases, if it wouldn't be for that lost old tree standing there, we wouldn't be able to guess that this place was covered by a coastal aquatic forest only a few years ago. If it wouldn't be for the last testimony of that isolated tree, we wouldn't imagine that it was a coastal swamp forest. So in most of the cases, the changes in the ecosystems are happening extremely quickly, but it's still slow enough that we don't realize it. And because we are humans, we need to see with our eyes what is happening. Next slide, please. And this is my last slide presenting an example of a change of an ecosystem. In this case, this wetland in Colombia being colonized by this invasive species. And this we can imagine that a few years ago, this was not invaded by these aquatic bouchons. And we can already imagine that the composition on the water column, the turbidity, the transparency, the level of nitrogen in the water is going to change so much. The communities living underneath are going to change. But those are only very few examples. In most of the cases, the changes happen and we don't realize that's changing. Next slide. So this photo of the Tasmanian tiger that was extinct in 1936 also bring us to the memory, the power of the red list of threatened species. that has been extremely useful in bringing the attention on the risk of species extinction. Now, the IUCN release from the species was developed in response to a growing human pressure. However, as the impact on the scale of humans into the environment grows in scale, acting at the species level is insufficient. So understanding the collapse of ecosystems and their risk, it's essential to act at a relevant scale. Next slide. So an ecosystem approach seems essential in the current scale of impact, given that we have intensified the scale of our impact from isolated habitat destruction or targeted species threats to complete ecosystem changes. And the red list of ecosystems appears as the science-based, the standardized framework that can allow us to assess and compare the risk of concrete ecosystems. Next, please. Now, for decades, the red list of species has been around for several decades already, celebrated anniversary, 17th anniversary last year. And now the challenge is for decades, we've been wondering, how do we develop a similar standard for ecosystem? But that was extremely complex because we want something that is precise, but general for all type of ecosystem. We want something that is accurate and at the same time that's simple. And these trade-offs between these opposed were taking the scientists with a huge headache for years and years. Next slide. Luckily, the convening power of IUCN came to a concrete resolution in 2008, and then in 2012, and then 2014. Basically, in 2014, the category and criteria for the IUCN release of ecosystems were approved, and since that moment, have been used as a global standard for assessing ecosystem risk of collapse. So, yeah, next slide, please. I want to stop there. Now, the challenge is that when we talk about red list of ecosystem, we're talking about different things. One example is assessing the global mangroves of the world. We finalized that analysis last year. Was a massive impact, more than 270 million people looking at the results, and that provide a global picture of how the mangroves are doing globally. Next slide. This can help us understand what's the impact on the coastal ecosystems, on sea level rise and the increase of intensity and frequency of a storm, and design some general guidance on how are we going to be addressing coastal ecosystems. In this case, for example, we can see the impact of the Hurricane Iota in mangrove ecosystems in Colombia. And if we don't leave sufficient time for this mangrove ecosystem to recover, it won't be able to be ready to protect these coastal ecosystems against the next hurricane. So the policies trying to help nature, help humans are essential in this context. Next slide, please. So today we have a bit more than 5,000 red list of ecosystem assessments around the world, more or less scattered around a bit more than 100 countries. Next slide. However, most of these 5,000 red list of ecosystems belong to the category of what we call national red list of ecosystems, which are similar to what Carol was showing about Namibia, Malawi, South Africa, Mozambique, few of the countries. Some of them have already finished. Some of them have finished their second red list of ecosystems, like South Africa. Some others are starting right now, like the case of Namibia. This is another example in Colombia where they did a national red list of ecosystems. In this particular case, they subdivided them in 81 terrestrial ecosystems, terrestrial and freshwater ecosystems. So most of these 5,000 red list of ecosystems across the world have been happening at this national level. And that's the type of results that are then much more easier to integrate within the biodiversity policies, following, for example, the protocol and procedure proposed by that publication that Carol was showing a few minutes ago. Next slide. So I'm going to just remind the public a couple of key elements of what is a red list of ecosystems, and then go a little bit into the uses of the results, and then we open the discussion and the questions. So as a reminder, the red list of ecosystem basically is the global standard for assessing ecosystem risk of collapse. There are new guidelines, and the link is over there, that explain in detail what is the application, how the standard work, what are the thresholds, the sub-criteria, and it's like a cookbook recipe. How do you bake this cake? But basically, the output of that process gives us an idea of which ecosystems are more at risk. And then based on that, it's how we can define policies and management strategies to reduce these risks. Next slide. I want to emphasize, I cannot emphasize enough the difference between risk and priority. So the red list of ecosystem assess risk, but it doesn't define priority. The risk is the probability of an adverse outcome over a specific time frame. Is this ecosystem at high risk of collapse or at low risk of collapse? Regardless of the risk of collapse of my ecosystem, this could be a priority or not. We may decide that we do want to protect mangroves, even if they are at low risk because they provide certain services, or we may decide that we don't protect whatever glaciers, even if they are at high risk of collapse, because there is very little we can do. Whatever. The cost and societal choices come into place when we talk about priority. What we do with the red list of ecosystem is a kind of scientific external analysis of the probability of an adverse outcome. What's the risk? And that's the result of the red list of ecosystem. So the red list of the system does not set priorities, it just informs about the priorities. Next slide, please. And the risk that we are assessing is the risk of collapse, which is a transformation of identity and a replacement by a new system. In some cases, the replacement by a new system, it's very easy to identify. Let's say that the grassland is replaced by a human settlement. That's very clear. In other cases, it's less clear to define what that collapse means, and that is something that needs to be stated as part of the red list of ecosystem assessment. When does the system has so dramatically changed that we can no longer call this forest a forest, and now we should call it a grassland, for example. Next slide. And this is going to be my only slide about the category and criteria. So you are welcome to have a look at the guidelines or to the online courses that I will refer later. The methodology for how the red list of ecosystem work, it's basically a set of 5 standard criteria, 5 standard diagnosis processes that quantify the most common pathways for collapse. So a change in distribution or degradation of abiotic processes or a degradation of the biotic interactions and so on. And as a result of that process of analysis, we achieve a risk category that goes from least concern, vulnerable, endangered, critically endangered, and then the equivalent of extinct on the species that would be collapse for ecosystems. Next slide, please. So let's keep in mind this difference between the global assessment, like the map here reflecting the global mangrove red list of ecosystems, and the national assessment. In this image, you can see the risk status of the ecosystems of Colombia, to think about how can we use this further in concrete examples on how do we use these results for the applications on the ground. And we've seen in the previous presentation with Carol from South Africa, how the integration of red list of ecosystem, red list of species, and red list of species, key biodiversity areas, protected areas can serve for mapping biodiversity priorities. But let's have a look at some other uses. Next. Next. So there is a wide range of applications on the red list of ecosystems, from development planning, planning protected areas, restoration strategies, reporting to CBD, to private sector investment decisions, disclosure. I'm going to organize those in two big blocks. And I'm going to briefly talk about the left-hand side, which is more national policies, national planning, national reporting, and then about the right-hand side, which is more about private policy, private practices, how the sectoral practices are being influenced, how are we disclosing and influencing the private sector. Next slide. So Carol has already mentioned showed this diagram on how do we, and if you want to know more, please have a look to the link that's in the chat to access the publication on mapping biodiversity priorities, but that propose a very clear scheme of how do we move from biodiversity data to planning priorities on the ground. Next slide. I encourage, if someone is particularly interested in the use of red list of ecosystem for restoration, I encourage you to have a look to this other publication using ecosystem risk assessment science for ecosystem restoration, which basically propose also a scheme on how do we use the results of red list of ecosystem to define, implement, and monitor restoration practices. In the example of this graphic, for example, a part of the data from the red list of ecosystems include historic distribution. That's the green image on the left. And then that can inform us of where are the places where an ecosystem has been lost. So areas that could be potentially targeted for a restoration for a particular ecosystems. And what are the remnant areas? So the areas that could be targeted for a restoration plan, improving the integrity of the system. And there is entire description on how to address this process of restoration in this publication. Next, please. Carol also mentioned the relevance for national authorities of reporting on red list index of ecosystem as part of this reporting to the Global Biodiversity Framework. And the technical support centers like SANBI or Centre de Suivi Écologique or others will be supporting countries, but are countries that will have to report as part of the GBF reporting on what is the status. And in that context, there is also a link here for a small issue brief explaining how ecosystems are integrated within the Global Biodiversity Framework, basically at two levels. One is the red list of ecosystems and the links with the headline indicator A1. Another one is the extent of natural ecosystems with the headline indicator A2. But then the monitoring guidelines propose using the global ecosystem typology across some of the other targets, including, for example, protected area, in something very similar to what was explained by Carol before, evaluating the representativity. So how much of this particular ecosystem is protected, which is the proportion protected for each ecosystem type. And that's very, very helpful to identify gaps and realizing that dry forests are not protected while tropical forests are, for example. Next slide, please. To facilitate the process of countries compiling information on data on red list of ecosystem and preparing red list index of ecosystems, we've prepared a red list of ecosystems inventory, and the link will also be shared, where you can have a look of the format that the Global Biodiversity Framework is going to be asking countries to report on, which is basically aggregating the different ecosystems at the same ecosystem functional group. In this case, for example, you could have deciduous temperate forest, T2.2, you would have 12 ecosystems grouped together under the same line, and this would give a range on the Red List Index across the different risk level for all these 12 ecosystems that appear in the T2.2. Next slide, please. Okay, a quick overview now on the uses of Red List ecosystems for private sector and businesses and influencing private business practices. And then we'll stop. So next slide, please. So we've seen more and more countries developing their own biodiversity information systems online used to inform private sector decisions, including offsetting and preliminary evaluations of impacts. Here there are examples of Colombia, Chile, but I know SANBI has also an information system platform. Some other countries have spatial information platforms virtually that are used for evaluating screening, basically, so that there is a preliminary assessment easily available for private users, typically for example, mining sector or infrastructure sector. Next slide, please. One of the big questions is trying to bridge the gap between the mitigation hierarchy, the vocabulary used within the context of the mitigation hierarchy, and the type of vocabulary that we use in our biodiversity assessment. So the mitigation hierarchy would typically, and that's something that the project financed by the French corporation that Carol is leading is doing an excellent job, is building this gap between how do we assess biodiversity, red list of species, red list of ecosystems, how do we prioritize and plan nationally, and how do we use those results in concrete to inform decisions from the business impact mitigation and ecological compensation that use the process of avoid, minimize, restore, and then offset, the hierarchy of mitigation, as we call it. So the data from red list of ecosystems are often very useful in the first step of the mitigation hierarchy, especially on the avoid section. However, as we move down to the right-hand side, it's mostly site information that is going to be useful for the restore and offset the later stages. The priority should always be given to the first steps of the mitigation hierarchy, but on-the-ground data for the later stages is always highly recommended. Next slide, please. And here is a theoretical example developed by the colleagues on that project in Mozambique on how developing a linear infrastructure that could be a road or a power line crossing through threatened ecosystems and evaluating alternative itineraries for that linear infrastructure that would avoid threatened ecosystems in a first step and then would avoid intact sections of that ecosystem. It would be the ideal process. And we are trying to organize this logic and this on how to use this information in a more concrete methodological way. Next slide, please. I'm going to just very, very briefly mention the 10FD Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures and IFD International Finance Corporation Performance Standard 6, which are two of the guidelines and reference for disclosure and investment limitations. So the 10FD is setting up the standards for disclosures on nature-related risks, and they propose a very concrete approach called the LEAP approach: locate, evaluate, assess, prepare, where the red list of ecosystems comes into place, especially in the locate part, identify ecosystems affected by business activities and whether those ecosystems are threatened or not. And then later down the road into the evaluate, assess, and prepare. Now, the challenge is how do we provide the information on red list of ecosystems so that businesses willing to disclose them can have access to all this information? And we are working on that at the moment, trying to provide data accessible for countries so that they can include it into their disclosure mechanisms. And the next slide, please. And then finally, the AFC, the International Finance Corporation Performance Standard 6 that appeared in 2012. So I've highlighted this because I think it's relevant. Remember from our first slides, the red list of ecosystem standard were approved in 2014. So in 2012, they used a selection for identification of no-go zones or called critical habitats that, including highly threatened, are unique ecosystems where projects will not be implemented unless very specific conditions apply, which means that there is a limitation on the finance available for big projects. Let's say it's a mine, or it could be a hydroelectrical or whatever, requiring financing from the IFC unless they clearly justify some of the elements below. So including operating in a threatened ecosystem, it's immediately triggering a red light in getting this finance for this type of investments. Next slide, please. So in practical terms, and I'm gonna finish with this, when the partners here are confronted the red list of ecosystem, I suppose it's gonna be mostly either reading an assessment or starting an assessment process. When reading an assessment, I think it's very important to have a critical look of what it is that's been assessed, at which scale, which criteria have been assessed, and what are the background documents. Don't look only at the final results, but do have a look at the analysis that's behind that, similar to a red list of species, where you would look at why is this species at risk. I think it's extremely relevant to have a look at why this ecosystem is at risk. And I like this cartoon of the doctor saying, "Oh, your cholesterol has me really worried." And actually the patient is having other very, very serious injuries that the doctor is not even looking at. Something similar could happen with an ecosystem assessment. So when you read an ecosystem assessment, do read very carefully, is this ecosystem assessment missing some elements? How are we gonna use the information included here, not only the final status? And then if you are starting an assessment process, remember to be very clear of what questions you want to answer in which area, and get your team trained and define clearly the time-bound process and the transparency on the process. And finally, next slide. Yes, there is a link to a couple of online courses. There is a basic introduction course, the link to the guidelines, and the course in the IUCN Academy for assessors. And next slide, and the website IUCN RLE, where there is a number of resources, including assessment, guidelines, the database, and the link to the IUCN Global Ecosystem Typology. Next slide. And this is the current red list of ecosystem partnership that we are about to renew very soon. And the group leaders on the thematic group on the red list of ecosystems, Dr. David Guth, Keith and Professor Emily Nicholson. And those are the current partners around the partnership. Don't hesitate to approach either the technical support centers like SANBI or any of the Red List of Ecosystem partners for help and support in implementing this tool if you need it. And I think that's it. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Veronica. And that's
Thank you to you, Marcos. Thank you so much. And thanks also for sharing all these resources that definitely they are very useful. If I can recall the cooking book, the cooking book, sorry, that is currently in English, and it will be soon available too in other languages, including in French. And similarly, you pointed at the online course, if I'm not mistaken, is already available in French too.
It is already translated. I'm not sure if it's publicly available or they are finalizing the revision of the French version. But if it's not publicly available, it will be very, very soon.
Thank you. So we will keep an eye on these two resources that are already available in English, but soon in French. We will also keep an eye on our medical checkups, so it doesn't happen the same that your cartoon. And while we are waiting for some questions, please, as always, all questions are very valid. You can use the chat option. You can raise your hand or post it on the Q&A option. I may have one question, Marcos. I find it super interesting. You pointed also the work that you are doing with the global ecosystem typology that is being recognized globally, not only for the global biodiversity framework, but has it been recognized by other established framework? In this case, I'm talking about climate.
Yes, so the same team that developed the Red List of Ecosystems framework, so led by Professor Keith and Professor Nicholson, they realized that there was not agreed global typology classifying the world ecosystems, and that's how they came up with the need to develop the IUCN global ecosystem typology. It was published by IUCN, I think it was 2021, something like that. And then since then, it's been growing recognition and acceptance far beyond the use of Red List of Ecosystem that was the initial purpose, including, for example, national capital accounting, and it's currently the framework recommended by the UN Statistical Division, the CIA framework. It's also recommended to report on the different targets for the global biodiversity framework, including protected areas or restoration, disaggregated by the different units of the global ecosystem typology. For example, how much, not just saying what's the hectares being restored in the country, but what are the hectares disaggregated by different types of forest or mangroves or wetlands or whatever. The same for protected areas. And I'm not really sure in the context of climate whether that has also gained acceptance. I'm not very sure about that.
I think no, just out of curiosity, because we understand that it is the ongoing process for coming up with the set of indicators under the global goal on adaptation, and there is a specific expert group on biodiversity and ecosystems. And we understand that the Red List Index is part already, more from the species angle, but it was just out of curiosity to know, like, where are we up when it comes to ecosystem, not which is also part of the goal. Maybe just a follow-up question, Marcos. I will use the fact that I have you here, even though we share office on a daily basis, to ask you something else when it comes to the Red List of Ecosystems, because some of the projects that are part of the Partnering for Climate community portfolio. They work already on restoration. They have some restoration projects, commonly on mangrove restoration in both in the west and east coast of Africa. So could you please elaborate a little bit more on the application you pointed on the Llanos ecosystem, restoration of the Llanos ecosystems in Colombia? What were the main outputs of this work? It may be useful for colleagues online.
Yeah, well, in the case of Colombia, and I can try to find that paper and put it online. They did a very interesting paper with a cost-benefit analysis on restoration for the different ecosystem types, crossing the distribution of ecosystems and the access to the land to restore and the impact on the restoration action. And they design a national priorities on what would be the low-hanging fruits, assuming cost and benefit of restoration. We use that as one of the several examples to refine that methodology that explained in that book of using ecosystem risk science for ecosystem restoration. The logic behind is that most of our restoration actions serve for reducing the risk level of an ecosystem. Very often there are ecosystem restoration that are targeting maximizing ecosystem services. But assuming that what we aim to do is reducing the threat level of a particular ecosystem, there is two potential actions we can take: either increase the surface of that particular ecosystem in areas that have been lost, or take the areas where the ecosystem still remains and then reduce the threats in those areas or increase the integrity by eliminating some of the degradation factors there. And then using these two approaches, so increasing the surface in the area that is lost and increasing the integrity in the areas that remain, what we end up doing is reducing the threat level. So let's say moving from endangered to vulnerable, or from vulnerable to least concern. The challenge is that the methodology proposed there is that scale of time, the similar what we saw with the pigeon, that because of the time frame is long and the changes at the ecosystem level take time, we need to forecast and imagine what are the trajectories that we are getting into. So under the current scenario and the current trajectories, where is the ecosystem going to be in 30 years? Now, doing these changes, where is the ecosystem? How are we changing that trajectory and where the ecosystem will be in 30 years without action and without restoration actions? Because most of the project, the challenge have is that this very short project time frame of 1, 2, 5 years. And that makes it very difficult to project what are the real impacts in the midterm, let's say 50 or 30 years. And that we propose some ways of addressing that within that publication also.
Thanks, Marco. So if I understand well, it is possible to work in a context of red list of ecosystems, even though we have a short-term time project, right? If I have a project which is only lasting for 3 years, it doesn't matter. We can still do a red list of ecosystem assessment because we can use trajectories and other information.
So the assessment itself uses standard timeframes of 50 years, either from the past or into the future, or a historic timeframes in 1750. So the timeframes for the assessment are fixed to that window. However, when we operate at a project level, trying to change, for example, restore an ecosystem, because we are operating a shorter time frame, we need to look how this change is impacting the trajectory over a longer window. That's what I mean by interpolating. Yeah.
Exactly. It was mostly like for colleagues here in the room, don't be afraid about using the tool. You can still use it as part of your project with the information that you had available and work on trajectory and projections mode, as Marcos is pointing. Okay, well, today it seems like everything has been quite clear, a lot of information today, and no one has more questions, and I really don't want to take all the space myself. I will leave for a last comment while awaiting for another question. Don't be shy, really. During the last session, we have many colleagues who raised the hand. This is another option that you have. If not, I would like to make a link with what you just mentioned too before, Ali. Okay, but before I go to my point, we have one question. I don't know if you would like to say personally, but I can't read it out loud. Marcos, you mentioned that most RLE assessments have been conducted at a national scale. What would you say are the key difference and obstacles to conducting RLE assessment at a larger spatial scale, regional or global? I think it is good because you also presented the global mangrove assessments.
Yes, and there is indeed a value in global assessments. We are currently on the process of assessing global corals, and it's definitely going to provide some clarity globally on how is the real risk of coral ecosystems, for example, or whatever, mangroves or whatever it is that we are assessing. There is two main challenges. One is we are realizing that for countries and for national authorities, including the results of a global assessment within the national priorities tends to be more difficult in most of the countries. Many countries want to have their own assessment because it's their own and they trust it and I know what it's here and I've done it in my own country. And they are a bit more suspicious about using an assessment that somebody else has done it and that covers the world. That's why we are not necessarily putting that much effort into global assessment. However, there is a great value on assessing all the corals of the world or all the mangroves or all the whatever tropical forests together with similar methodology and similar regional units that then you can compare and say, okay, now that I've been using similar indicators and similar methodology across the world, I can clearly say that the tropical forest in Indonesia is clearly much more threatened than the one in Central America, whatever it is. I just made it up. But the comparability, it's more powerful when you do it in a more homogeneous way worldwide. Now, the challenge is the uptake of the results by the national authorities. And of course, there is a number of challenges in the methodology of how do you define the units and so forth, how do you get the assessment data, but that type of questions that are also going to be present in national assessment anyway. So I would say that the biggest difference is the comparability of the results and then the uptake by the national authorities.
Thanks, Marcos. And it seems like colleagues in the chat, they are getting excited before the end of the webinar. So we have another question from Nicola. Thanks, Nicola, for being so proactive in today's session. The question is in French. I will read it to you and translate for colleagues online. La liste rouge des écosystèmes est-il un outil qu'on peut mobiliser dans le cadre de la mise en œuvre des solutions fondées sur la nature? Just allow me to translate. Is the red list of ecosystem a tool that we can use in the context of nature-based solutions?
Yes, and I'm trying to find an article. Here it is. There are a couple of examples. Let me post this in the chat. How do I answer? Type an answer. No. How can I type an answer? Type an answer. Here it is. Let me put an article. I think there is this example of using the red list of ecosystems and the nature-based solution global standard as an integrated process for climate change adaptation in the Andean high mountains. So there are a few examples. I just copied that one article that came to mind, straightforward. And it's clearly one of the possible indicators to use as part of the criteria on biodiversity benefits. out of the 8 criteria on the nature-based solutions. And that's, but I'll let you have a look at that article that would provide a little bit more of details of how that was particularly done in the context of the Andean high mountains.
Thanks, Marcos. Indeed, very important point when Nicola, he did mention, because as part of the Partnering for Climate community, all our projects, they focus on nature-based solutions for adaptation and climate resilience. So of course, doing this kind of assessment are very relevant to understand whether our nature-based solutions on the ground are being effective, and where also we should be implementing those solutions. Are we selecting the right ecosystem? Are we selecting the right areas where we want to implement our actions? I don't know if there is any last comment, but in any case, Marcos, I have to say thank you so much again. And just to build upon one of the points that you mentioned in terms of also how the red list of ecosystem and the associated tool could be used for other contexts. And you mentioned the natural capital accounting, which is the next section that we will have as part of the next session and the last session as part of the Science Wednesdays. It will be our colleague Leander Rice. He will be presenting on that front. So could you mention a bit, just very brief, on these connections in between the red list of ecosystem, the global ecosystem typology, and natural capital accounting?
Well, I'm not an expert in natural capital accounting, but if I understand well, you have to measure stocks and flows. Stocks are what the ecosystems are, what is their extent, and what is their condition, and then the flows, which is what are the use that humans are doing of it. So ecosystem services, basically. So the red list of ecosystem data based on the global ecosystem typology would go into the stock component of the natural capital accounting. So what is the extent and what is the condition? And having the same ecosystem framework, the same ecosystem typology, and the IUCN global ecosystem typology helps a lot in that process of linking both together. And then you need to look at the ecosystem services, and that's an entire new thing, and that's more how humans are using nature and whether we are under the entire framework to understanding flows and ecosystem services around it. Yeah.
You are not an expert on capital accounting, but you explained it very well. And you made a good link to our next session, as I mentioned, on natural capital accounting. And it will be our colleague also, Leander Rice, who will be going through that session. And I have to say, Marcos, now we are at the end of the webinar. We'd like to thank you, but also we'd like to thank Carol for the presentations she made right at the beginning. Thank you so much to both of you, and hopefully the red list of ecosystem work will keep growing and growing. Perhaps some of the colleagues online, we may reach out to you, or they can always reach out to the NAbSA team, and I leave it to you the new email, so then you can get in touch with the NAbSA team for any further question you may have, or if you would like to have more information about the red list of ecosystems, or if you are just curious and would like to know a little bit more about the work that is being done by Marcos and his team, and of course about IUCN members and partners on this area of work. So with this, I have to say thank you so much to all of you for joining us again on these Science Wednesdays. We await for you for the last session, and please stay tuned, because the NAbSA website will be public soon, and then you will get much more information, not only on the NAbSA project, but on the whole community of partnering for climate projects working towards climate adaptation and resilience in sub-Saharan Africa. So thanks so much to all of you, and see you very, very soon. Bye.
Thank you.